When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, Germany was in economic ruins. The nation was still reeling from the catastrophic hyperinflation of 1923. Unemployment stood at over 6 million, and the Treaty of Versailles had crippled German industry with crippling reparations payments totaling 132 billion gold marks. The Reichswehr, Germany's military, was restricted to just 100,000 men with no tanks, no air force, and a tiny navy. Yet by September 1939, just 6 years later, Nazi Germany possessed the most powerful military machine in Europe, 103 divisions, 3,195 tanks, 4,203 aircraft, and a rapidly expanding Kriegsmarine. The question that has puzzled historians for decades is simple but profound. How did Hitler pay for it all? I'm Frank Dawson, a historical researcher and documentary presenter with years of experience studying military history, intelligence strategy, and wartime decision-making. This is an investigation of Nazi Germany's secret financial machinery that made World War II possible. Now, before we dive into this story, please give this video a like. It really helps push the video to more viewers and supports the channel. The answer to this mystery lies not in one single scheme, but in a web of financial deception, theft, forced labor, and economic sleight of hand that would ultimately require the plundering of an entire continent to sustain. The architect of Hitler's initial rearmament financing was Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank and minister of economics. Schacht was a financial genius who understood that Germany's rearmament had to be hidden from both foreign powers, monitoring Treaty of Versailles compliance, and from the German public, who would panic at massive military spending while still suffering economically. In 1934, Schacht devised an ingenious but ultimately fraudulent scheme centered on something called MEFO Bills. He created a dummy corporation called the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or MEFO for short. This shell company was nominally owned by 4 major German industrial firms, Siemens, Krupp, Rheinmetall, and Gute Hoffnungshütte. However, MEFO existed only on paper with a starting capital of just 1 million Reichsmarks. Here's how the scheme worked. When the Nazi government wanted to purchase military equipment instead of paying cash, they issued promissory notes guaranteed by MEFO. These bills could be exchanged at the Reichsbank for cash at any time, carried 5% interest, and had terms of 3 to 6 months that could be repeatedly rolled over. To the outside world, it appeared that private companies were simply extending credit to each other for industrial purposes. In reality, the Reichsbank was printing money to fund secret rearmament. Between 1934 and 1938, the German government issued 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of MEFO bills, equivalent to roughly $40 billion today. This represented fully half of Germany's military spending during this period. The beauty of the scheme was its invisibility. The bills didn't appear in the national budget, didn't show up in public accounts, and allowed Hitler to claim Germany was respecting disarmament obligations while secretly building the Wehrmacht. But there was a fatal flaw. MEFO bills were essentially government debt disguised as commercial paper. They had to be redeemed eventually. And when they came due, they would create massive inflation. Schacht himself grew increasingly alarmed by 1938, warning Hitler that the MEFO system was unsustainable and would collapse the German economy. Hitler's response was chilling in its simplicity. He would pay off the debts with the wealth of conquered nations. War wasn't just Hitler's ideological goal, it was his economic necessity. While MEFO bills funded the initial buildup, Hitler needed additional sources of immediate capital. The answer came through what the Nazis euphemistically called Aryanization, the systematic theft of Jewish property, businesses, and wealth. This wasn't random persecution. It was carefully orchestrated economic plunder on a massive scale. In 1933, Germany's Jewish population numbered approximately 500,000. less than 1% of the total population, but they controlled significant commercial enterprises, banking interests, and property holdings built up over generations. The process began gradually with discriminatory laws that forced Jews out of professional positions, then accelerated dramatically after the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. Jewish business owners were pressured to sell their enterprises at a fraction of their value to Aryan buyers in the forced sales. Those who resisted faced arrest, concentration camp detention, or worse. After Kristallnacht in November 1938, the pace of Aryanization became a feeding frenzy. The Reich flight tax, originally designed in 1931 to prevent capital flight during the economic crisis, was weaponized against Jews. Any Jew attempting to leave Germany had to surrender 25% of their assets, later raised to 90% or more. And between 1933 and 1945, the Nazi state extracted an estimated 120 billion Reichsmarks from German and Austrian Jews through Aryanization, confiscations, special taxes, and forced sales. To put this in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to $400 billion in today's money, more than enough to fund several years of military buildup. Department stores, factories, art collections, real estate holdings, bank accounts, insurance policies, jewelry, even household goods were systematically cataloged and seized. Nothing was too small for the Nazi state's attention. By 1936, Schacht's warnings about economic sustainability were being proven correct. Germany lacked sufficient foreign exchange to import the raw materials needed for continued rearmament. The solution was the four-year plan, announced at the Nuremberg Rally in September 1936 and placed under the control of Hermann Göring. The plan had one overriding goal: make Germany self-sufficient in critical war materials within 4 years so that it could survive an economic blockade during wartime. The British naval blockade of World War I still haunted German military planners. This time, Germany would not starve. The centerpiece of the four-year plan was synthetic production, particularly of fuel and rubber. Germany possessed virtually no natural oil reserves, and rubber plantations were entirely in Allied-controlled territories. The IG Farben chemical conglomerate developed processes to produce synthetic gasoline from coal through hydrogenation and synthetic rubber called Buna. By 1939, Germany was producing 22 million barrels of synthetic fuel annually, about 46% of its total consumption. These synthetic production facilities required massive capital investment, much of it funded through continued MEFO bill issuance and the plunder of Jewish assets. The Leuna synthetic fuel plant alone cost over 600 million Reichsmarks to build. But synthetic production also required something that proved far cheaper than imported raw materials: slave labor. As early as 1933, the Nazi regime began establishing concentration camps, initially for political prisoners. Within a few years, these camps evolved into economic assets. Inmates provided essentially free labor for quarries, construction projects, and eventually armaments production. By 1937, the SS had established economic enterprises that exploited concentration camp labor. The Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke, or German earth and stone works, used camp inmates to quarry stone and manufacture bricks. Labor cost: food rations worth a few pfennigs per day. Market rate for equivalent German workers: several Reichsmarks per day plus benefits. This economic model would expand exponentially during the war years. By 1944, approximately 7 million foreign workers and prisoners of war, plus concentration camp inmates, provided forced labor for the German war economy. This represented roughly 20% of Germany's total workforce. The cost savings were staggering. It's been estimated that forced labor saved the Nazi state approximately 30 billion Reichsmarks during the war years, money that could be redirected to military production. But the true value of slave labor wasn't just in wages saved. Forced laborers could be worked to death and replaced with fresh victims from conquered territories. There was no need to maintain safe working conditions, provide adequate food, or respect any labor laws. Industrial firms like Krupp, IG Farben, BMW, Volkswagen, and Siemens bid for contracts to utilize camp labor, paying the SS a small daily fee per worker while the workers themselves received nothing. When German troops marched into Austria in March 1938, they immediately seized the Austrian National Bank's gold reserves, 1,383.5 tons of gold, worth approximately 748 million Reichsmarks at the time. This single action provided more immediate liquidity than a year of MEFO bill issuance. The annexation of the Sudetenland in October 1938 brought Czech industrial capacity, particularly the Škoda Works, one of Europe's largest arms manufacturers. When Germany occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, it seized not just the Czech National Bank's gold reserves of 23.1 tons, but also Czech foreign exchange holdings, industrial equipment, and the entire productive capacity of Czech armaments plants. This pattern would repeat across Europe. Poland's conquest in September 1939 brought not just territory, but plunder. Industrial equipment, locomotives, agricultural machinery, livestock, grain stores, and art treasures. The Nazi occupation authorities established an official exchange rate that valued the Reichsmark at absurdly inflated rates against occupied currencies, allowing Germany to essentially print money and use it to strip occupied territories of resources. France's defeat in June 1940 was an economic catastrophe for that nation and a bonanza for Germany. Under the terms of the armistice, France was required to pay occupation costs of 400 million francs per day, later raised to 500 million. At the artificial exchange rate imposed by Germany, this meant France was paying roughly 20 billion francs annually, about 40% of France's national income. These occupation payments funded not just German troops stationed in France, but were redirected to fund the wider war effort. The Bank of France's gold reserves, approximately 900 tons, fell into German hands, though some had been evacuated. Belgian gold reserves of 356 tons stored at the Bank of France were seized and shipped to Berlin. Dutch gold reserves of 140 tons met the same fate. By 1944, the Reichsbank held approximately 1,300 tons of looted monetary gold, worth roughly 1.5 billion Reichsmarks. But gold was just the beginning. Germany systematically stripped occupied territories of food, industrial equipment, rolling stock, coal, iron ore, copper, petroleum, and anything else of value. It's been estimated that resource extraction from occupied territories provided Germany with approximately 40% of its food supplies and 30% of its industrial raw materials by 1943. France alone was forced to deliver to Germany 42% of its total production by 1943. The economic relationship was simple. Occupied territories would be worked to exhaustion to fund the German war machine, and their populations would be fed just enough to maintain productivity, but no more. When Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, needed to increase war production in 1943, he didn't need to find funding. He simply requisitioned more forced laborers from occupied territories and concentration camps. Much of the looted gold, particularly gold seized from individuals in concentration camps, had to be laundered to be useful on international markets. The Nazis faced the problem that selling obviously stolen gold would be recognized and rejected. The solution was to melt down identifiable gold items, recast them into standard gold bars, and sell them through neutral countries, particularly Switzerland. Between 1939 and 1945, Germany sold approximately $1.3 billion worth of gold to Swiss banks at 1940s prices, equivalent to roughly $20 billion today. Swiss banks asked few questions and provided Germany with the foreign exchange needed to purchase critical materials from neutral countries like Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and Turkey. Some of this was looted monetary gold from central banks, but a significant portion was what came to be called victim gold, melted down from jewelry, watches, dental fillings, and other items seized from concentration camp victims and murdered Jews. The SS established a special account at the Reichsbank called the Melmer account, named after SS Captain Bruno Melmer, who delivered the valuables. Between August 1942 and November 1944, Melmer made 76 deliveries totaling approximately 5 million Reichsmarks worth of gold and other valuables. This victim gold was melted down alongside looted monetary gold, making it impossible to distinguish. The Reichsbank then sold these mixed batches to Swiss banks, who were willfully blind to the source. Without this money laundering operation, Germany's ability to purchase critical materials from neutral countries would have been severely constrained. Beyond all these schemes, Nazi Germany funded its military through a simple expedient: running up massive debts that would only matter if Germany lost the war. By 1939, Germany's national debt had reached 40 billion Reichsmarks, roughly 75% of GDP. By 1945, it exceeded 400 billion Reichsmarks, over 200% of GDP, though by that point the figure was essentially meaningless, given the total collapse of the German economy. German armaments manufacturers were promised payment after the war. Forced sales of government bonds to German citizens extracted additional capital. The government simply printed money, creating inflation that was partially suppressed through rationing and price controls. The Nazi leadership understood that either Germany would win the war and pay its debts with plundered wealth from a conquered continent, or Germany would lose and the debts would be someone else's problem. This devil's bargain was made explicit in a meeting between Hitler and his economic advisors in 1942. When warned about the unsustainable debt levels, Hitler reportedly laughed and said Germany's creditors could collect from the Kremlin after Germany won the war. So how did Hitler fund a huge military when Germany was broke? The answer is that he didn't fund it in any sustainable sense. He created a massive Ponzi scheme that required endless expansion to survive. The initial buildup from 1933 to 1939 was financed through the hidden MEFO Bills, theft of Jewish assets totaling over 120 billion Reichsmarks, synthetic production programs that cost over 5 billion Reichsmarks but reduced foreign exchange needs, and increasing levels of deficit spending that added 30 billion Reichsmarks to the national debt. Once the war began, the system shifted to direct plunder. Occupation costs extracted from France alone, totaling over 80 billion francs by 1944. Looted gold reserves from occupied countries worth approximately 2 billion Reichsmarks, resource extraction, providing 40% of food and 30% of raw materials, forced labor from 7 million workers, saving approximately 30 billion Reichsmarks, and systematic theft from murdered Jewish populations across occupied Europe. The entire system was predicated on conquest. Each new territory had to be seized and stripped to pay for the conquest of the next territory. When the Wehrmacht failed to capture Moscow in 1941, when it was stopped at Stalingrad in 1942, when the tide turned at Kursk in 1943, the economic system began its inevitable collapse because there were no new territories to plunder. By 1944, despite having stripped all of occupied Europe, Germany was running short of everything: fuel, food, ammunition, replacement soldiers. The synthetic fuel plants were being bombed into rubble. The slave labor force was dying faster than it could be replaced. The gold reserves were exhausted. The occupied territories had nothing left to give. Albert Speer performed miracles of improvisation to keep production going. But you cannot conjure resources from nothing, and by early 1945, the German war economy was in a death spiral. When Soviet troops entered the Reich Chancellery bunker in May 1945, they found Hitler's safe. Inside were 47,000 Reichsmarks in cash, approximately $360 at the wartime exchange rate. That was all that remained of the greatest military-industrial buildup in history. The Nazi economic model wasn't sustainable economics. It was industrialized theft on a continental scale, and it required millions of deaths to function. In the end, the true cost of funding Hitler's war machine was paid not in Reichsmarks or gold, or even oil and steel, but in human lives. The economic historians have calculated the monetary costs, but no accountant's ledger can ever truly balance the books on that debt. I find it grimly appropriate that the man who designed the original MEFO bill system, Hjalmar Schacht, survived the war to testify at Nuremberg. When prosecutors asked him how he thought Hitler would ultimately pay for rearmament, Schacht replied simply, "He never intended to pay for it at all." As usual, I look forward to reading your comments. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share. You can also help to support the channel. Details in the description box below.